So I remember watching a special a few years back about this CBS news anchor by the name of Walter Cronkite. And I remember that while he was doing his thing from the 1960s to the 1980s, he was believed to be, by the American public, the most trusted man in America. And he brought the nightly news. And then I remember thinking, man, when was the last time I watched the evening news? And then I started thinking, man, do I ever listen to the news? If you're like me, you probably look at the news with a lot of skepticism and just this idea of not knowing who to trust. In fact, a recent survey by the Pew Research Center found that 67% of US adults say that made-up news and information causes a great deal of confusion about basic facts and current issues. So in this episode, what I'd like to do is look at how we got here from the most trusted man in America delivering for us the nightly news to 2 out of every 3 Americans being utterly confused. And then I'd like to look at how to navigate the space of utter skepticism and confusion and being able to piece together what are the facts to these news stories that are being spun every night. We'll explore all of this in this episode of what I like to call Office Hours. Wait, we're calling it office hours, but I'm shooting from my home. So how did we get to this place? Well, in the early days of TV, the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission, was launched to 1, help the medium of TV to grow, and 2, protect the public's access to information. And to hold a license, networks had to provide a public service to its viewers, and boom, evening news was born. Now, one of the stipulations that networks held to hold these licenses was to abide by what they called the Fairness Doctrine. And this meant that any controversial subject had to be balanced by opposing views. And this meant that the controversial subjects like the coverage of Vietnam War or the Civil Rights Movement or the Watergate scandal had to have multiple perspectives. Maybe something that was more conservative and something that was more liberal, just to kind of balance out the story. Now, for the first few decades, it was a noble work on the part of journalists, but it didn't drive much profit to the networks. The way that the network saw it was that it was a public service to the audience, and it was a way of holding their license. Now, that all changed in the early 1980s with some big-time newsworthy events like the Iran hostage crisis, where network executives actually started to see a profit. Nightly coverage of events like this actually boosted ratings, and it drove profits from advertising. And executives of these networks took notice. They saw this as an opportunity. Now, at this point, the FCC did what it set out to do. The medium of TV grew so much that there were multiple channels, and then multiple networks, and then multiple news stations. Now, the following year saw protection regulations get softened until in 1986, the Fairness Doctrine was shot down, citing First Amendment rights over freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So no longer were networks charged with protecting access to information. The nightly news could be spun to be as polarizing or as partisan as the network executives allowed for. All of this to drive ratings and profits. And now, 35 years later, with social media and digital news, the more clickbaity and contentious, the more hits, the more likes, the more subscribes, the more views, as opposed to maybe a neutral title that you might find in maybe the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. Now, for journalists, this equates to more volume. The more stories they're able to push, the more that drives revenue for advertising to these networks, which drive profits, which make for them bigger salaries. It all boils down to dollars and cents. And if we're honest, it just doesn't make sense to do the careful investigative reporting that we did in decades past. So how do we navigate this space? What do we do when we can't make sense of what the news is trying to tell us? How do we get to the bottom line? Well, first, we got to check ourselves. We have to understand our own point of view and our own biases. That same survey that I cited from the Pew Research Center found that most Americans only trust some sources of information as opposed to other sources. And when there's so much news to consume, most Americans then turn to news that already aligns with their own point of view. Is it that we're only listening to stories that tell the side that we want to hear? What if maybe there's another side of the story that's not being told? A way to think about this is to take an aggregate of different news stations. So if there's a story worth following that really captures your interest, follow it on different news networks. How are they covering that event from different angles? Obviously, they're going to have their own spin on it, and they're going to have their own side of the story to tell. When we're able to see multiple sides of the story, we're able to kind of formulate our own opinion on the matter, and that becomes our truth. We also have to know our role when it comes to this whole news media. I may not like a lot of the clickbait that I end up clicking on, but it's on me not to click on that. The more I click on that, because it's either catchy or grabby, it means that in some ways I'm contributing to this machine that creates profits for these networks that end up spinning these stories. And so for me, I need to do a better job of treating every story with pause and with skepticism, and not too quick to click on anything just because it's newsworthy in its caption. Another thing I would say, in a time when there's so much expertise out there, where everybody that has a YouTube channel claims to be an expert, the one thing we have to remember is that there are journalists out there that are experts in their field. They do investigative reporting as a public duty, and it's part of who they are to tell the story without slant. There are folks out there that want to get to the bottom of every story that they cover, and you can find them when you read the front page of a Wall Street Journal or a Washington Post or a New York Times. That doesn't mean that every time you click an article from one of these top news sources, you're going to get the best journalism. But it doesn't mean that they don't provide excellent journalism and investigative reporting. Another way to approach this is to actually watch the values and the biases of the people that are delivering the news. I mentioned Walter Cronkite before, and he would close out every nightly news service with, "And that's the way it is."
And that's the way it is.
However, there'd be some times where he offers his own commentary on an event, like the Vietnam War. And he would actually leave out, "and that's the way it is," because he is offering his own commentary. In that case, he retracts "the way it is" because no longer was he giving facts, but his own opinion on the matter. I would look at him as a rubric for integrity. He was trying to tell the story without slant, but understood that he couldn't keep his own thoughts out of every piece of news. That's a man for me I could follow. I could follow that man if he were still alive, because he sought to give us the news and saw the news as a public service, not merely as entertainment or clickbait. So definitely watch for the values and the biases of the people that are delivering you the news. Do they treat the news as a public service or more as entertainment? Are they trying to demonize the other side, or are they really critically hearing other views in a constructive debate? This is one of the things that we need to watch for. So I get the news can be confusing. Often we treat it with skepticism, but it doesn't mean that there's not good news out there. Go ahead in the comments and let us know if there is a way that you found helpful for you in terms of navigating this world of partisanship and polarization. And if you found this video helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe. It would help us to deliver more content for you, which we would try to put out every week. I appreciate your time and attention, and until next time.